Well, greetings. On behalf of Wesley Seminary, I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us today for Why Should Leaders Follow God and God's Ways? Insights from C.S. Lewis with Dr. Aaron Perry. Now, this is the third webinar based on Dr. Perry's work in his book, Leadership Philosophy in the Fiction of C.S. Lewis. So we're thrilled to have Dr. Perry again today to share his wisdom on that. And this is also an event as part of the Wesley Seminary series that has a goal of resourcing the local church, our alumni, and our current students. So we're thrilled that you joined us today, or if you're watching this on the recording, we're thrilled that you're joining us. Now, at Wesley Seminary, we are offering our Master of Divinity and our MA, Master of Arts in Ministry degree 100% online in both English and Spanish. We have upcoming class starts in May. We would love to chat with you about that, answer any questions that you might have. We'd also like to talk to you about our Doctor of Ministry program as well. One of our knowledgeable enrollment staff would love to chat with you at 877-673-0009 or email us at wesley@endwest.edu. Now, should you have any questions during today's presentation, please leave those in our Q&A forum. I will be monitoring those, and Dr. Perry has agreed to answer as many questions as time allows after his presentation. Now, as I mentioned, Dr. Aaron Perry is with us today. He is Associate Professor of Pastoral Theology and Leadership at Wesley Seminary, where he has served since 2016. He and his wife, Heather, have 4 adorable children. Aaron loves the local church and pastors and is grateful to God for both of them. It is my distinct pleasure, again, to welcome a pastor, an author, a friend, and yes, still my favorite Canadian, Dr. Aaron Perry. Doc?
Thanks so much, Joel. Great to have everybody with us today. Today is the third of the lectures or presentations I've developed from the book I have on C.S. Lewis and leadership. And I think today's is actually most pertinent. Perhaps you can think of it as most pertinent. I was reflecting with my friend Lenny just a few moments ago about why I think this webinar is so pertinent, so relevant for today. And it is simply this: if there ever was a day where we had separated formation from leadership, the spiritual formation of the leader from the effectiveness and competence of the leader, if there ever was a day where we had those things separated, God help us that day is gone. That day is gone, and may it never, ever return. You can imagine several leaders who have done amazing things. You can line up all their accomplishments, all the things that they have done, all the influence that they have had, all the things that have been done in their name, all the good that can be stacked up and written down on a resume. And yet it's all been lost because they were not who we thought they were. If you remember the famous line of Denny Green, coach of the Minnesota Vikings, he described the opponent of his football team as they are who we thought they were. Well, there have been a number of leaders that we have recently, and in like a steady stream of them, who have not been who they thought they were. So I think today's webinar is especially pertinent, not just for those who have extensive influence, but for all of us who have influence right down into maybe 1, 2, or 3 other people, or wherever God has placed us and whatever position God has blessed us with and where he has placed us. So I want to answer or reflect on this question: why should leaders follow God and God's way? And really, if I could start with a very simple answer, it is simply this: because you become like who and what you follow. You become like who and what you follow. And for Lewis, the contrast is severe. The contrast is significant. People become like who or what they follow, and there are really only 2 options. One is to become like God, and the other is to become like a malevolent force or the devil. Those are really the only 2 options. We are being formed and framed in one way or another. You can maybe think about the Screw Tape Letters, Lewis's brilliant psychological reflection on the nature of temptation, where a senior demon is posing counsel and coaching to a junior tempter on how to sway his patient. He's giving them all these insider traits and all these insider clues in this psychological reflection on the nature of temptation and sin. And in that book, one of the things that the senior tempter Wormwood offers is that to be human is to be in this kind of process. It's always to be in process. It's always to be in formation, one way or the other. Of course, Lewis is deeply formed by the Augustinian tradition, the Platonic tradition, where human beings are souls, right? There's an extension of who they are throughout time and an extension of the self that outlasts the body. And he says that the spirit is drawn to the good or to the evil, one way or the other. And as a body, as one who is embodied, they are in time, capable of acting and therefore of change. So human beings are always drawn one way or another and are always in formation, either becoming more like God or becoming more like the enemy. I want to reflect on the very nature of this, on the nature of this kind of pulling in one way or the other, especially with regard to our reflections on leadership, by using what's called agency theory. So first, I want to describe agency theory. Second, I want to show how we might use it as a lens into Lewis's fiction. And then finally, offer some wisdom that Lewis has for us. So what is agency theory? Now, this is something you already know and have seen. This is something you're already familiar with, and you might be able to use it as a lens in a couple of different ways. Agency theory simply says that there's a relationship where one, the agent, takes action or makes a decision on behalf of another who is the principal. And usually the context of this is that there's a limitation or an opportunity. So agency theory says that one, the agent is acting on behalf of another person. Now, a couple of examples where this might be the case. An agent might be acting on behalf of a principal in terms of complex work. So you might think of the nature of management. If you're in a position where you have people who report to you and they have people who report to them, you're seeing agency theory at work. You can't manage all the people who are on those down lines, but you work with people who are spreading out the work. The nature of the organization is complex. If you are a lead pastor and you have 2, 3, 4, 20, 30, 40 people who are on your staff, you can't usually have somewhere between 6 and 8 direct reports. And you can see how that would multiply out so quickly to become a fairly complex organization. Agents do work on behalf of principals whenever there is complex work. Agents do work on behalf of principals, or they make decisions and take action on behalf of others whenever there is expert work to be done. This is easily seen in terms of legal work or a person doing surgical work. So a number of years ago, I had a significant injury to my hand where I had sliced my finger. I cut the nerve, I cut the tendon, I had cut everything right down to the bone. I need to have it repaired. Now I couldn't do that work by myself. In fact, I got a little bit curious as to what the repair of a nerve and tendon and artery would look like in the pinky finger. And I looked it up on YouTube. What would the surgery look like? I couldn't last more than like 3 or 4 seconds. I was like, oh my goodness, like too much blood for me, right? Somebody else needed to do that work on my behalf. The agent was taking work on my behalf. They were acting in my stead. Third way you can see agency theory at work is whenever there is distant or remote work that needs to be done. Now, in a day gone by, you might think of the sailor or the explorer who is sent on behalf of a king or a nation to see what other parts of the world look like. It is not the sailors' work on their own. They're acting on behalf of another group or on behalf of somebody else. Or maybe you think about the person who's doing investigation on behalf of a police department, or the investigator who's working ultimately for the public to find out what had happened. An agent taking action or making decisions based on the principle. Finally, there are issues of opportunity. So maybe one, the principal, has a vision, envisions something coming to be, which will be enough work that it's more than what they can do. Maybe they have all the skills. Maybe they could work really hard and get all the work done, right? So they could manage the complexity of it. They have all the skills to do the specialist work. Maybe it's close enough that they could do this. But the nature of it is such that there's an opportunity that can only be grasped, that can only be taken if multiple people are doing work. And all of this is happening at the behest or the leadership of the principal. So there's an opportunity that needs to be done. Maybe you think about this in terms of a franchise, right? The the person who's doing the work on the ground somewhere else, somebody else could do that work. It's not necessarily specialized work, but the person who owns the franchise is one who sees the opportunity if they will empower others, if they can empower others to make decision and take action on their behalf. Now, a couple of the tensions that can emerge in the midst of this, one is inequalities or asymmetries, right? The principal might have more knowledge or time than the agent. And you can see how that kind of power differential can create different situations that would be difficult to work through. You can see how there might even be a flipping of that asymmetry or inequality. The agent might be one who has more knowledge than the principal. And as a result, they're able to skew things, or they're able to do things that the principal might not approve of simply because they are absent and don't know all the ins and outs of what is happening. You can easily see how this leads to injustice, where an agent could be doing things that the principal would not approve of, or the principal may have aims that the agent doesn't even know that they're participating in because the ultimate aims are being kept or hidden one from the other. Finally, this is a situation where there could be ignorance. Think about how many times we rely on other people to make decisions on our behalf or to take action on our behalf simply by trust. I use the example of the surgeon who was operating on my hand, and I didn't know him. I was entrusting a good deal of my future and my body to him, that what he would do would be done well, that his care would be professional and competent. Now, of course, we have ways to limit our ignorance through certification. We have ways to limit it by having accredited training and that kind of thing. But yet there still is a measure of ignorance that exists between the agent and the principal. Now, why do I bring all of this up? I bring it all up because if you remember back to how this started, we become like who or what we follow. God has created a context where we are agents, where we are so often agents taking action and making decisions that represent what God would do and that affect what God has decided or that God would decide to do in a situation. You remember, of course, the famous expression, what would Jesus do? Right? Comes from Charles Sheldon's book from the late 19th century, In His Steps. And this popular phrase took on a life of its own, becoming a bracelet that went around the wrist and inspired this ethical reflection. Well, that reflection is based on a sense of agency theory, that we are acting on behalf of Jesus, that we are taking action with him as the principal. He is the one who is in charge. He is the one who is whose will is getting put into effect, but we are the ones who are taking action. And if we think about this, we can apply some of these tensions from agency theory in our own leadership lives as well. Number one, there are inequalities and asymmetries. Maybe you think about your leadership and some of the strain and stress that you carry, and you wonder, does God remember we are human? Sure, maybe God could handle all that complexity. Maybe God could handle all of that, but does God remember that I am human and that I maybe don't have the same, the competence, I don't have the same capacity that God does? Maybe we think about injustices. If you've been in leadership for long, no doubt you have suffered injustices. You recognize that suffering is simply part of God's way. God has set up a context, the context where we become like who or what we follow, and that context is marked with suffering. Agency theory also helps us to recognize that ignorance is still a challenge and a difficulty. There's simply sometimes, even if we have the right intention to do what God would have us do, even if we would like to take the action that Jesus would take, or even if we want to do what Jesus would do, we might not know. There's complex scenarios and situations that are not easily sorted out. And as a result, we're not sure what action we should take as God's agents. Now, in all of this, I'm doing a play off the language of agency theory and agents, because those are actually two different things. But in Lewis, they can be really easily brought together. Agency theory, as I've described, is one doing work or taking action or making a decision on behalf of another. And becoming an agent or becoming a meaningful actor, for Lewis, those are put together. It's as we take action on behalf of another that we become a meaningful actor. It's as we take action on behalf of another that we become a meaningful actor. And for Lewis, like I said, the options are really significantly polarized. It's either take action, become a meaningful actor, and become like God, or take action and become like the devil, or become like the enemy. See, the opportunity to make men and women like himself also risks that men and women might become very unlike himself. This is one of the phrases that Screwtape uses when he writes to Wormwood. He says, he's amazed that God would have these creatures be one with him, but yet themselves, taking meaningful action on behalf of God, and yet simultaneously becoming meaningful actors, becoming one themselves. How can they be one with him, but yet themselves? Wormwood says that for the devils, they wish for humans to become like food. They are food that they consume, but for God, they are individuals who become like friends. So maybe we might bring it back to this question here. Well, if the choices are so stark, why would anybody take a choice not to become like God? Why would anybody not choose? Why would we choose not God's way? Why would we not choose to go in this way? Well, let me tell you a story. I am working with one of my children to help them ride their bike. And let me tell you, they are so close. They are closer than even they realize. I think they think that they've got a bit of a ways to go, but I know they are right on the edge. And yet riding the bike is going to be the journey for them to take those final steps in learning how to ride their bike probably is yet going to have a couple of falls. For them to learn how to ride their bike, I have to remove my hand. I have to remove my hand from the seat and let them take those first pedals and feel what it's like to propel their own weight and catch their own balance. I know that before they actually learn that, they're going to fall again. And so they are hesitant. They are reluctant for me to let go. They know that not only is this difficult, but this is dangerous. That's the context of becoming like God in God's way. If we are people who are going to follow after God, become leaders who are marked by this leader, become agents, people who take action and make decisions on behalf of the principle, and thereby become meaningful actors, it is going to be difficult and dangerous. In fact, there's a measure of safety and security. There's a measure of ease that comes from acting the other way. The temptation is always to be drawn to the easier route. I hope this webinar encourages you by painting a couple of contrasts to continue following after God and God's way, even in spite of the difficulty and the dangers. Let me share a couple of stories from Lewis's accounts that describe what happens when we don't follow God and God's way. If you are familiar with the cosmic trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength, then you're likely familiar with this character, Weston, or the Unman. Weston or the Unman. And Out of the Silent Planet, Weston is this powerful antagonist who has this grand vision for humankind and exploring out and moving out the ability of humankind and capturing more planets and obtaining more resources so that humankind can expand their global, their universal reach and their power. In Perelandra, the second book in this trilogy, Weston has become transformed to be the Unman, where he kind of operates as the demonic tempter in this world that is not yet fallen, presenting all the reasons why the Lady of Perelandra should reject God and God's way. And yet in this account, as it unfolds, one sees how Weston, or the Unman, has continued to break further and further down. He's become more and more less of an agent, less and less and less of a person, until Lewis finally records this brilliant conversation between the Unman and Ransom, who is the protagonist, the hero, the one who is used of God to do God's work in this world. After a day of presenting their temptations and then their rationales for staying faithful to the Lady of Perelandra, Ransom arguing why she should stay faithful and the Unman arguing why she should choose her own way and make the selfish choice, they have this interaction. Ransom, the Unman, or it said. Well, said Ransom. Nothing, said the Unman. Ransom, it said again. What is it? Said Ransom sharply. Nothing, it answered. Again, there was silence, and again, about a minute later, the horrible mouth said, "Ransom?" You imagine, you can hear the childish game that is going on here, right? Ransom? Nothing. As soon as attention is achieved, nothing. Now, the brilliance of this account is that both names of the characters are revealed. Ransom really is the character's name, and nothing really is what the unman is becoming. Lewis has this reflection. We sometimes have this picture of agency on the dark side, or agency formed by the devil as this kind of towering intellectual genius, right? The evil villain. Whereas in reality, to be formed in the way of the enemy, or to be formed in a way that is not God's way, is to become actually less and less and less and less. Now, there is a paradox here, because as Lewis will elsewhere say, he says that bad archangels don't come from mice. Right? Good mice become bad mice, and good archangels become bad archangels. There's a potential for that which could be formed to the good to have that amount of power to the bad, and to an evil purpose as well. And yet at the same time, because Lewis is formed in the Augustinian tradition, that which is evil is always that which is a twisting or a curving in on itself. Simultaneously, this towering and growing up and up and up, as the unman becomes so powerful that he can sway a whole world, and yet he is becoming less and less and less and less. Maybe you can picture the leader who has become so consumed with something in their life, maybe even something good or a good end, but everything else has become forgotten around them. And so while they become more and more competent and powerful and able to do more and more around a small bit of something, they become less and less and less of a person, less meaningful relationship, less meaningful action, less avocation or hobby or a holy hobby, becoming more and more and more in one way, and yet becoming less and less and less. Second example, maybe I skipped over it. I can't find it at the moment. The second example that I want to give to you is from the character Wither, from That Hideous Strength. Wither is the associate director at the NICE, the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. If you're familiar with the text, you know that this organization is this grand organization that is meant to bring all this good to England, and yet it is a very corrupt organization, and there's all kinds of deviousness and untruth and lying and deception and violence that happens through the NICE. But Wither is one of these fascinating characters, because Wither is one whose name reveals what he becomes. In the organization, the NICE, Wither is this towering figure whose word is law, whose presence is so powerful that he seems to be everywhere all at once. And people often remark how he needs little sleep. No one needs to wake him, even for the earliest of meetings, because he's already awake, he's already present. And yet, Lewis has revealed what Wither is becoming in his name. Number one, wither means to wither, right? To flag, to become less than what he is. And wither means where? Where is he? In fact, that's one of the things that we later find out, that it's like, while it seems that wither is everywhere, it also seems that wither is nowhere. And so people can look into his eyes and realize that there is nothing there. It's this simultaneous, great, powerful individual, and yet one who is nothing. The pursuit against God, or the pursuit that is not God's way for the leader, ends up in this kind of nothingness. Now, in contrast, let me give a couple of examples of what happens when people do follow in God's way. One is of the Dufflepuds. Now, what a strange example if you're familiar with them from the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But remember what Kariakin, right, this fallen star, who says of the Dufflepuds, is he's overseeing them for a while, but he says the goal is not that he would continue to oversee them forever, but they would become self-leaders, that they would be able to govern themselves. See, God's desire is always for them to have this kind of agency, this important and meaningful selfhood, right? Not simply to become ones who are sheerly dependent, but ones who, in the midst of their dependence, become truly who they are meant to be. Perhaps a better example is Shasta from Horse and His Boy. If you recall, Shasta and the troop of Win and Bree and Erebus are on their way to try to save Archenland, to warn them that the Calormenes are coming with some treachery. They are coming with a surprise attack. And along the way, they grow a little bit complacent and they realize that they have rested too long and they've lost a sense of urgency. And Lewis has this great line. He says, it's very difficult for one to do what they ought to do when they have never been forced to do so in the first place. You hear an echo that God has the desire that these characters would be able to be in charge of themselves, that they would be self-leaders. It's amazing that as this troop is winding out of energy and they make a final dash to the hermit's house, and Win and Bree and Erebus all stay there, Shasta alone is given the task to run and warn the Archenlanders. And guess what he does? He runs. Lewis has this line, run, run, always run, 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 always run. Shasta has become the person who's able to be in charge of himself. He's become the person who's been able to take this meaningful action on behalf of Aslan in order to warn Archenland of their impending doom. In fact, as Lewis tells the story, all of this has been something that Lewis has put, or that Aslan has put in motion, even from Shasta's earliest days. You see, the vision that Aslan has for Shasta is that he would become a self-leader. Connected with that is a sense of the leader being a differentiated self. Now, this is a concept or a term that comes from psychology, and specifically in family systems, it's often used, where one's selfhood is not always enmeshed in another. In family systems, sometimes you see how one person is enmeshed in the identity of another person. And so they hardly have a thought or a feeling outside the permission or outside the guidance or influence of another person. Contrary to this, Lewis's idea is that leaders would become differentiated selves, that they would become in some ways their own person, never against or never outside the context of God, but precisely within the context of God. Here's what the Lady of Perelandra says. She describes this kind of differentiated self that is yet connected and dependent on God as a delight with terror in it. She says, how remarkable for one's own self to be walking from one good to another, walking beside him as himself may walk, but not even holding hands. Think back to the Screwtape Letters. They would be one with him and yet themselves. Lewis often tells the story of how people take on this kind of differentiated self, this self-leadership, that it often happens through conflict. Perhaps you think of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Peter is off discussing with Aslan battle strategy, and he hears Susan's horn calling for help. And there's this moment of who's going to go and help her. And some of the animals are ready to rush to save Susan from the snapping jaws of Mogrim as she has climbed a tree, and he is waiting just beneath her, his jaws waiting to devour, to attack her. And Aslan has this phrase. He says, let the prince win his spurs. Let the prince win his spurs. Conflict in this moment is going to show Peter who he is while making him become who he is. After this conflict where Peter emerges victorious, Aslan dubs him Sir Peter Wolfsbane, right? This is who he is. In Prince Caspian, Peter finds and grasps the same sword which was used in this conflict. And in that moment, they all realize and see that he is becoming the High King Peter once again. So often leadership is formed in the midst of conflict, that God provides just enough support for this to be a meaningful place for people to emerge, to become meaningful agents, to take the proper action, to act on behalf of God, making decisions and taking action, and in so doing to become meaningful actors. So often happens in the midst of conflict. We become people who have our own thoughts and feelings by expressing our own thoughts and feelings whenever those might not well be received. Another more complex example, and from one of Lewis's books that is not as popular, is from Till We Have Faces and Orual. Orual is a child who is described as very ugly. She is not the desired child of her father, who is the king of a kingdom called Glome. He, of course, wants a son, and he is often upset at his daughter's ugliness. Through the story, Orwell eventually dons a veil or a mask, and she continues to go about with this identity, her face hidden and covered. But as the king is going further and further into derangement, and Orwell is on the ascent to become the Queen of Gloam, there's a scene where the king asks her, "Do you mean to set your wits against me?" And Lewis describes the stare that happens between the daughter and the father, the emerging queen and the failing king. And she simply says, "Yes." From that day, the king never struck her again, and her ascent continues. Now, there's a deep complexity in the identity of Orwell, a brilliant story that Lewis has about the nature of leadership, actually. But in that, we see how conflict has served for Orwell to become her own person, at least in that moment, as she becomes the queen. And in fact, her reign is solidified whenever she has hand-to-hand combat with another royal from another kingdom, and her victory seals her leadership. Now, I want to finish up this reflection on wisdom from Lewis in terms of becoming agents with a couple of maybe postures or things I'd like you to keep in the back of your mind as you are going about your own formation, as you are in leadership and have influence over friends, family, a business or church, whatever else it is. I want you to keep these things in mind. Number one, Lewis always makes clear that God is so often crafting the context for the adventure that will make us like him, right? God is so often crafting the context. Now, one of the things that Lewis does to show this is by the use of the weather. In the first book of the cosmic trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, the weather speeds Ransom up so that he's able to come across a bit of injustice, and he jumps into the conflict. And this is how the adventure starts. If you remember the Pevensies in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, they're stuck inside on a rainy day. Polly and Diggory in The Magician's Nephew, the whole beginning of Narnia and the Chronicles starts with an adventure because it was one of the coldest and wettest summers. And finally, the meaningful actions of Peter, Susan, Lucy, and Mr. and Mrs. Beaver is facilitated because there is snow that comes down to hide their tracks. Now, there's a number of other illustrations or examples we can use where weather plays this part. But Lewis's point is that God is often involved in the mundane of life to craft these contexts where the adventure of our formation can take place, where the adventure of us having the opportunity to follow God and God's way can take place. And I encourage you, as we'll get to in just a second, how is God crafting a context around you for the great adventure that will make you like him? That you will become like him as you exercise faithfulness in the leadership role that God has blessed you with and given to you. Number two, and I think this is so important in the midst of a world that is especially obsessed with brand and fame and recognition, God's intentions are so different from simply role, status, and worldly recognition. In reflecting on the nature of characters from some of Shakespeare's plays, Lewis has this line. He says, "The role of the Christian is to play great parts without pride and little ones without dejection." See, God's purpose for you is so much more than what you would accomplish on his behalf here. God's purpose for you is to become like him. What greater glory is there? The Great Divorce so brilliantly undoes all this sense of fame. The character who has left hell to visit heaven and is being guided around by George MacDonald sees a woman who has this great glory and grandeur and troop around her. And MacDonald says that she is one of the great ones, but that on earth she was probably never heard of. And then he says this, "You have heard that fame in this country and fame on earth are two quite different things." I know how difficult it is. I know how tempting it is to compare ourselves to other people and to compare what we are up to and what we are doing and where what others think of us, what our role and status and level is. But God's intentions are so much different and more, so much beyond ours, and yet unchanging, that he would have you become who you are meant to be in him. The reason that I want you to engage in these kinds of reflections is because not only is it true that you become like who or what you follow, but so many of your followers will become like who or what you are. See, the context where God has created, where we as agents can become like him, the principal, is also one that has this ongoing effect, where when we are the principals and in positions of leadership, that those who follow after us, those who take our guidance, those who are enacting our decisions on our behalf and actions on our behalf, they will become like us. The very context that God has created for us to become like him makes it possible that others will become like us. And so we as leaders have to reflect on, who am I? And who am I becoming? Am I involved in games and status competitions and things that I certainly would not want to pass along to those whom I love? Are we playing losing games? It's true. Why leaders should follow God and God's ways is because we become like who or what we follow. And because others who follow us will become like who or what we are. So 4 reflexive questions. Questions I'd like you to bring back to yourself as you reflect on some of this material. Number 1, where is God setting an adventure up for me or for you? Where is God setting up the adventure? What are some of the mundane details that you need to pay attention to? I love what Richard Foster says. He says we need to shine a light into the corners of life to see where God is. What's the equivalent of God working in the weather in Lewis's stories in helping you to become who you are meant to be, one with God and yet yourself? Take a moment to slow down. Have you ever noticed that you can't do this work in a hurry? You can't shine a light in the corners in a hurry. It takes time and a bit of slowness. Number 2, what is your own story of transformation? What is your own story of transformation? How have you become more who you are meant to be, even as you have become more in line with God and more part of God? What's your own story of transformation? Learning our own story is vital because it gives us all kinds of resources then to share and impart to others as they are followers of us. And we start to model for them. Why is it important to engage in reflecting in our own story so that they will do the same, so that they do not get caught up in any other game except the pursuit of God and becoming like him, even as they take meaningful action in the spheres of influence that have been given to them? Number 3, how do I allow measures of failure and freedom in followers? We learn by experience. Have you ever noticed how Aslan is so often missing from the stories until right when he is needed? But he's allowed people to take meaningful action, and sometimes to their detriment, and even to the detriment of others. Now, God alone knows the complexity of this, and we do not pretend to know that we have all this complexity mapped out, but the principle holds true. Do we provide measures for our followers to fail and to learn from their failure, to learn how to get back up? Do we give them freedom to take meaningful action and to make meaningful decisions? Otherwise, they won't become meaningful agents. They won't take meaningful action. They will always only become parodies of us. Number 4, what motivations and incentives are prominent in my leadership? Now, you can put this in 2 ways. 1, how do you incentivize people? How do you encourage them to take meaningful action, to take right action? And how do you get motivated? What motivates and incentivizes you? How is your heart filled up and motivated to take meaningful action? Now, we didn't get into this a whole lot, but one of the things that Lewis is so keen on teaching is that it's very important that the ends, what we are after, has a measure of connection to how we get there. That what we are after is connected to how we get there. If you read his sermon, The Weight of Glory, Lewis has this fine description of learning and how what we learn or how we grow has to be connected with who we are becoming. In other words, the formation that we use has to be connected with the kind of person we want to become. Let me finish up with this very mundane example, but it's a very simple one as well. Whenever my children are tasked with a chore in our home, they'll often ask, well, is there a prize to it? Sometimes there is. Sometimes there isn't. Ultimately, I want them to put away silverware and stack dishes and do these things to help take care of a home because I want them to have the joy of running their own home and being their own person. I want them to take that kind of meaningful action. And yet, even as they are growing in that direction, I sometimes will give them rewards and treats along the way, right? Lollipops. At the same time, I don't want them to be people who only put away dishes and silverware and do their chores and participate in meaningful relationship because of the payoff. Think back to the difficulty. See, becoming a self and helping others to become selves as well is difficult, dangerous work. In fact, even while we participate in the system, in the context where we become selves, ultimately it is God's work. And so my final encouragement to you is this. Keep in mind the promise of Christ in the book of Revelation. Now, to those who overcome, he promises to give himself. See, the reward of the faithful life is not recognition. The reward of the faithful life is not worldly fame. The reward of the faithful life is not great and grandeur and amazing work and renown. The reward of the faithful life, empowered and made possible by the work of Christ, by the power of his Holy Spirit, is to become like Jesus. Why do we follow God in God's way? Because that is the way we become like Christ. Friends, thanks for tuning into this. Happy to take some questions now as we reflect on some of these reflections and have some discussion.
Thank you, Aaron. That was great. I really enjoyed that. I love those reflexive questions as well. That very, very insightful. Appreciate that. We do have one question that came in via the chat. Maybe we could start there. As Aaron said, if you have questions, this is the time to submit those through the Q&A forum. I've got one, now two through the chat, so we'll go ahead and get started if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
It says, I appreciate your work here. It must have taken you many hours in reading C.S. Lewis. Can I ask if any of your work incorporated in this book is included in the D-Min program or the Doctor of Ministry program through Wesley Seminary?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things, right? If what I'm learning truly is sinking in and formative in my life, then it can't help but come out, right? It's kind of like the whole thesis of this is that, well, if Lewis is going in, then Lewis is going to come out as well. So in the D-Min, I also have students read The Abolition of Man, which is a short combination of three of Lewis's essays on the nature of humankind. It was published about 80 years ago, and it is incredibly relevant for today. So yes, this material is all the way through the D-Min in leadership at Wesley Seminary as I teach it, and the classes that I teach as part of it, and the Abolition of Man specifically is part of that program.
Wonderful. And I'd like to echo something you said earlier. We were talking about the agent and the principal relationship. I was involved a few years back in starting a franchise for in-home non-medical care, and you hit it completely on the head. I mean, the nail on the head. It was a partnership, but there was one partner that was silent and had another business that he ran. So yeah, a lot of responsibility there, a lot of accountability. And making sure that the person that wasn't as actively involved was still kept in the loop. And yeah, I really appreciated that. Another question through the chat here we've got. I have not read any of C.S. Lewis's books yet. I'm very interested in your concepts here in leadership. What book would you recommend I start with?
Well, it just depends. So if you are wondering where to start with Lewis, and you have children, or you have a long drive ahead of you, then I would say start with his fiction, because it's so enjoyable, right? It's so enjoyable. We've gone on long van rides as I've gone to and from visiting friends and family, and C.S. Lewis has been a constant companion of our family as we listened to his stories. And I think one of the best ways that we can start to model leadership for others, especially if we have children, is to show that we are ones who learn from others. And so it's a great privilege to read stories one with another. Beyond that, if you're wondering, if you don't have children to start and you're wondering with some of Lewis's essay work, I would of course recommend Mere Christianity. So Mere Christianity is a collection of talks that were given during the Second World War that Lewis gave over the radio airwaves and that were carried throughout England. and they simply describe the Christian faith. And so I would very much suggest that Mere Christianity would be a great place to start. Finally, I would suggest one of his adult fiction. So I would encourage either the Screwtape Letters or The Great Divorce. So if you have children, Chronicles of Narnia is where I would start. If you are one who's inclined to think about his carefully reasoned work, I would say Mere Christianity. And then finally, if you're one who, and you can find these as audiobooks as well, and they can be listened to in not very much time, 3 or 4 hours for both of them, not 3 or 4 hours for each book. Screwtape Letters or The Great Divorce. Screwtape Letters is a reflection on the nature of temptation and sin from the perspective of a senior demon offering counsel to a junior tempter as he engages with a person to try and trip him up and move away from God and God's way. The Great Divorce is this fictional account of what happens if someone were to have a brief holiday from hell and could visit heaven, and the different reasons why they choose to stay or return to hell. And it's a brilliant creative accounting of agency and why we might choose, like I said, the less difficult and the less dangerous path, so to speak, and going against God and God's way.
Excellent. Let's see, we've got another comment in here. Dr. Perry, thank you for this presentation. I appreciate your last statement. The reward of the faithful life is to become like Christ. This statement will stay with me for life. Thanks again. Very cool.
Privilege.
Very cool.
And of course, it's that reward that God always makes possible, right? It's never done outside him. God has created the context by his Son and his Spirit to make this possible. So God is, Dallas Willard has this great reflection. He says that grace is opposed to earning. It is not opposed to effort. And so in a way, it's this simultaneous act of worship that God recognizes as he transforms us to be like Christ, so that in the end, we would say it was all of God. And yet we are also becoming ourselves in him.
Great. All right, we've got something else in here through the Q&A forum. This was great sharing. I was speaking to my professor about my struggle with the type of leader God wants me to be. You have also given me a greater interest in reading C.S. Lewis's work. I just purchased The Weight of Glory. Any recommendations?
So The Weight of Glory has a collection of essays, and The Weight of Glory is the title of the essay of the book. So it's a sermon. I think The Weight of Glory is a wonderful sermon. Excellent. My only encouragement would be, if you get bogged down in that collection of essays, pick something else up by Lewis as well and go through it too. But The Weight of Glory is one sermon. You can read it and get a snippet of why Lewis thinks formation is so important in order for us to be able to have the capacity for joy. Joy is, as he calls it, the serious business of heaven, right? Joy is not something we simply have without the work of God. It takes the work of God to make us beings who are capable of having the capacity for joy. Maybe you think of, which is very Wesleyan as well, right? The journey of holiness and transformation of sanctification is to make us beings who have great capacity for joy, right? It's to make us beings who are capable of loving greatly and experiencing the love of God and the joy that flows through us. So read The Weight of Glory itself. If you get bogged down, pick something else up by Lewis and don't give up.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, got another one in through the chat here. It says, great webinar and nice to learn from you again. My daughter is 10 and just finished the Narnia collection. Any other kid-friendly books?
10 years old. If she's wondering about Lewis, I don't know. I've gone through The Hobbit with my 9-year-old, and she loved it. We were almost done Lord of the Rings. It was a little bit beyond her, I would say, because it's so long. So it's hard to keep the plot and all the characters over that amount of time. But I've heard really good things of the Wingfield Saga. I haven't read it myself, but the Wingfield Saga, I've heard very good things of as well for children's fiction. So that might be one that would be of interest.
Awesome. Just curious, what was the first C.S. Lewis book that you read, Aaron?
The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Okay.
Now, maybe that's not historically accurate, but I can't imagine if I read another one that was not that.
Right.
I'm sure that was the first one I read.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, I think that looks like that wraps up our questions. Anyone else that would like to submit a question, if you're watching this via recording, just send that email to me, joel.hunt@nwest.edu, or to Dr. Perry, aaron.perry@nwest.edu. We would love to answer any questions that you might have. Also, when you're signing off today, you'll get a survey. For 3 of you that fill out that survey, we're going to draw at random lucky winners of our newest Wesley Seminary shirt. We are Wesley, so almost Wesley. So please fill out those surveys. We are reading those. They're very important to us. We are doing these webinars for you, and want to thank Dr. Perry again for his time. Want to thank Wesley Seminary for sponsoring today's event. I'd also like to give a shout out to Doug Drown and to Marty Hutchins and our IMT office for their work behind the scenes in getting the webinar set up and helping us with the surveys and the follow-up work. So thank you. Oh, wait a minute. I do have another question that looks like it's come in. Oh, no, sorry, just a comment there. So thank you to Doug and to Marty for that. And again, thank you for those of you that are watching. We're doing these for you, and we hope that you find these very informative and useful. And again, we're looking to resource you, our alumni, our students, and the local church. So again, if you're thinking about seminary, if you're feeling the call or you know someone that is, we have upcoming class starts in May. So we would love to talk to you about our MA, our MDiv, our DMin programs. Again, call us at 877-673-0009 or email us at wesley@nwest.edu. And you would get to be in class with some of our wonderful faculty, as Dr. Perry is one of those. Very proud of him and his work in our leadership programs, our doctoral programs, and very thankful for him and for his leadership there. Again, thank you for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And remember, we are Wesley, and you belong here. Blessings.